at a point in time coming off of a wild Saturday of college football. People are consistently peeking over at this board. He actually would not be my number one overall pick, nor would I bet him to be the number one overall pick. I think you got that next wave of NFL players, which is so enticing, which when you see Jaden Daniels come into the NFL and you go, I can get something like that with a guy with just as good an arm.
Pro Football Today, only on SportsGrid.
Anyone that's been to a sporting event, the atmosphere before a game, I think Game Time Decisions has that same exact atmosphere. This is our arena. This is what we do. There is going to be an energy to Game Time Decisions that you will feel night in and night out. The excitement you get when you lock your bets in, when you're figuring out what you want to do, we can zone in on the biggest games each night. I want this to be the place that people come to before the games start so they feel as ready as possible to lock in their cards. We are going to hit every single one of those markets that you need to know about. We're going to go through every single thing, and I've got a great team behind me that's going to help me get the job done. There is not going to be a better place, I promise you, than Game Time Decisions to get that new information, react to it, and be able to then bet accordingly. We will have everything at our disposal, and we will use that to our advantage. I'm Kevin Walsh. Tune into Game Time Decisions from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern on SportsGrid.
Welcome into college football today. It's time for the post-game show with Kasey Hudson and Rich Cirminello to get you running through this Saturday slate. And look, there's been a lot of exciting football taking place today. It's officially November, which means we are getting ready to close in on the end of the regular season for college football, but a lot to get into. Headlines that are going crazy because Penn State falls short to Ohio State. Then we've got some wild play going on between South Carolina and Texas A&M. Let's just say South Carolina's defense has held up to the hype in a number of ways. Not because they've let up 20 points, no, because of the shutdown plays that they have been able to execute on. More importantly, it's the sneaky upset of Louisville over Clemson. Clemson currently with the ball from what I'm seeing. So as these two games close out, Rich and I will keep you posted on all the action that's going on. But again, plenty of games to circle through to. Let's check in with Rich and see how he's doing. Some of the top games that poked out to him throughout this day. I already touched on Ohio State versus Penn State, but there's a number of games for us to get to. First and foremost, Rich, how are you? You've been on SportsGrid all day. I mean, a lot of college football going on.
Yeah, listen, I'm doing great, Kasey. It's a day started off fantastic for me. Got to spend 3 hours with my buddy Cam Stewart. We haven't been on the air together in a while, so we talked about the Penn State-Ohio State game, all of those 12-3 games, and then everything since then, to your point, has been wild. Lots of upsets, lots of near misses. K-State goes down. Iowa State suffers its first loss of the year. You mentioned Clemson. Did not see that one coming against Louisville. And, you know, Pittsburgh a week ago, 5 picks, 3 defensive touchdowns against Syracuse. Tonight in Dallas, they are being throttled by SMU. SMU suddenly... Not Clemson, SMU and Miami now the favorites to face off in the ACC title game in a month.
Yeah, definitely plenty of upsets and mysterious results in a number of these things. I mean, for one thing, as an accountability point here on SportsGrid, I was talking on college football today during one of the halftime previews, and I mentioned statistically everything lined up for potentially there being an under in the Florida versus Georgia game. You and I have talked here on college football today about some of the digressions that we've seen out of Carson Beck. He had 3 turnovers. Well, 3 turnovers in the last game the Florida Gators defense produced and turned into a win for them. And for the most part, they seemed in control of that game. They lose their starting quarterback before halftime, that is. And then before you know it, it racks up to that total there. So before we take it game by game, let's start with the game that probably took you most by surprise or was probably the most exciting one for you in today's slate.
Yeah, there are a lot of choices. I'm going to go with Kansas State. K-State was rolling with Avery Johnson. Defense was playing well. They looked like the next best thing to BYU and Iowa State in the Big 12. Houston right now is an interesting story. Like I like to get granular on a lot of these games and conferences. There are teams out there that know they're not competing for a conference title, not competing for a playoff berth, but you could see first-year coaches really starting to make some traction. Willie Fritz at Houston is one of those coaches. Deshaun Foster at UCLA is another one of those coaches. Those two teams, Kasey, are under 500, but playing significantly better since mid-October. So if you're looking for teams that have a lot to play for, maybe the record doesn't indicate it, but you can wager on teams that are trending in the right direction. UCLA upsets Nebraska in Lincoln. Again, playing significantly better, back-to-back road wins over Rutgers and Nebraska. Rutgers a week ago. And then Houston, Willie Fritz, to me, former Tulane coach, one of the best coaches, maybe best dozen or so coaches in the country, taking some time at Houston. Doesn't have the offensive personnel, but the defense has been stepping up. And to upset Kansas State as a double-digit underdog, that is a huge win. And now teams like that, like Houston and UCLA, they'll play the rest of November knowing that in each of these games, they've got a shot to become bowl eligible. And if you're a first-year coach and you really want to get some progress out of your young players, those extra 15 practices and one more game, that is essential to getting a fast start for 2025.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned the coaching perspective in all of this, because I heard, I believe it was Cam that asked you earlier, if you know the name of every coach in college football. But what also makes this an important perspective is that when you see certain football teams struggling with making progress or just kind of staying stagnant to last year's results, sometimes it's the players, sometimes it's having, too many star players, not enough players that are going to help assist in other ways, or sometimes it is coaching and play calling, something that's going to rise a question not only out of many football fans today, but some of the headlines when it comes to the Penn State versus Ohio State game. So a big perspective that I want to gauge from you on that one, because a lot of people are calling for some accountability from the head coach for Penn State, but more importantly, Ohio State's kind of had their number in the last couple of matchups that they have had, and we haven't seen the strongest performance out of Ohio State last week. I remember that was kind of a weaker point for them, but overall, just what did you make of this matchup, and what does it say when it comes to the head coaching conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that was one of the things I was looking at more than anything else. Beyond the player matchups, and there were some great ones, we'll see a lot of these kids on Penn State and Ohio State playing on Sundays for many, many years. These are two outstanding rosters. But for me, this came down to coaching. Cam and I talked about it on the air. This was a tie game going into halftime, or maybe a 4-point game going into, I think it was 14-10 Ohio State going into halftime. Coaching adjustments was going to be huge for both James Franklin and Ryan Day. Massive game for both of these coaches. Neither has done particularly well in these kinds of spots, especially James Franklin. I thought everything lined up perfectly for Penn State. Ohio State didn't look great last weekend, couldn't run the ball against Nebraska. Penn State, tons of mojo coming off to back-to-back wins. USC comeback win. Wisconsin without Drew Aller. Game is at home. I thought everything lined up perfectly. And again, they dropped the ball. The drives late, the inability to punch it in the red zone late. I think that falls on the players and the coaches. And for Penn State, this is going to be a tough one to overcome. James Franklin now 1-13 against top 5 opponents. Top 5 opponents are very good. There aren't many coaches that are over 500 in those games, but 1-13 is a blinking red flag that something is wrong here. Now, I'm in no way suggesting that Penn State should be considering a coaching change, but it's been almost a decade, and he has not been able to get this program over the hump, and it's going to be a tough November. They still might be a playoff team, certainly can get in with one loss, possibly with 2 losses, But until you can prove you can win these big games, I think Penn State is stuck in being a very good football team, but just not a great one. This was a lost opportunity today.
Yeah, and that's actually a great way to put that, because for somebody like me who's been gauging the season from week one and not trying to compare Penn State to last year's results, but kind of focusing forward on this season, I kind of thought, okay, maybe they're just a team that holds in there in the first half and then really packs the punch in the second half. But then you're kind of starting to see that might not be their pattern. Their pattern might be just, not the right play calls coming into the second half, showing up a little too late to their matchups. And they tried to reverse that today. I will give them a little bit of credibility for that, picking up 10 points in the first quarter, seeming like they were going to kind of try to find an up-tempo, nice, fast, and early. But, no presence in the second quarter, late presence in the third quarter, and then the fourth quarter was all Ohio State, resulting in a 20-13 loss for the Nittany Lions over the Buckeyes. And then you got Will Howard. What a storyline that was. Wanted to go to Penn State his whole life, felt a smidge of rejection by Penn State, said that he apparently wasn't quote-unquote good enough. And I thought that played a huge factor into this, but as both mentioned between the pair of us, we haven't particularly seen the most consistent play and results out of Ohio State throughout this season either. If it's not Judkins getting a lot of the groundwork done for them, then it's been slightly a bit of a toss-up, but more of a conversation to continue here, not only with Ohio State and Penn State, Kansas State, and so on and so forth, a number of games, not to mention we got to see where the results lie when it comes to Louisville versus Clemson, 33-21 as Clemson slides behind Louisville, and then Texas A&M and South Carolina. South Carolina extends their lead 37-20, so don't go anywhere. Stick with us here on College Football Today, the post-game show on SportsGrid.
He will be 2-7 against top 5 opponents in his 6 full seasons with the Buckeyes.
Now you're going to take on the road one of the best rush defenses in the country in Penn State. You're already having trouble rushing the ball. So what does that mean, Ben? That means Ohio State is going to have to rely on Will Howard to throw the ball on the road.
The early line, only on SportsGrid.
Anyone that's been to a sporting event, the atmosphere before a game, I think Game Time Decisions has that same exact atmosphere. This is our arena. This is what we do. There is going to be an energy to Game Time Decisions that you will feel night in and night out. The excitement you get when you lock your bets in, when you're figuring out what you want to do, we can zone in on the biggest games each night. I want this to be the place that people come to before the games start so they feel as ready as possible to lock in their cards. We are going to hit every single one of those markets that you need to know about. We're going to go through every single thing, and I've got a great team behind me that's going to help me get the job done. There is not going to be a better place, I promise you, than Game Time Decisions to get that new information, react to it, and be able to then bet accordingly. We will have everything at our disposal, and we will use that to our advantage. I'm Kevin Walsh. Tune into Game Time Decisions from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern on SportsGrid.
Welcome back into College Football Today, the post-game show here on SportsGrid TV with Kasey Hudson and Rich Cirminello running through this Saturday's slate. And look, a number of upsets and wild play. Rich and I started to unpack that a moment ago in the first segment. Just an update on the scores before we start diving into some other games from the top of the day. Louisville sitting with the ball right now. 4th and 13 at Clemson's 45 is currently what I'm seeing. 33-21 holding their lead. 1:51 left in that fourth quarter, so we'll see if they can close the door on Clemson and make that or continue to make that one of the most interesting games of the day. Then flipping to the other game, Texas A&M and South Carolina. South Carolina extending their lead 37-20, currently with the ball first and goal at Texas A&M. Right there trying to get that scoring drive going. 2:22 left in the fourth quarter. Then Tennessee finds a way to get back in some position of pulling off a W today, 28-18, currently with the ball as well. 4 minutes and 55 seconds left in the fourth from what I'm seeing. And then look, Pittsburgh's trying to swerve away from a little bit of embarrassment here. First and 10 at SMU's 37, but they're behind 41-11 versus an SMU team that just really came out packing the punch. Now, with the updates of the scores around the nation, as mentioned, we're going to take it back to the top. One of the top games, Duke versus Miami. We've seen Miami rally in the second half of a number of games this year. Funny enough, actually, we saw them pull off a lot of fourth quarter magic versus Louisville, who was in full control and almost pulled off a victory over Miami, who is now currently about to pull off a victory over Clemson. I mentioned all of that, Rich, because Duke seemed to be in almost complete control of the majority of this game until Miami did what they always do. They remained calm, composed, and they pulled through the execution at the end of the third quarter all the way through the fourth quarter. Cameron Ward with another ridiculous performance, 400 passing yards, 5 touchdowns, and that 5 touchdowns only came with 1 interception. The touchdown to interception ratio just continues to be so spectacular for this guy. I mentioned the composure and his ability to lead his team and keep their head in the game, hence not falling short, but packing on the points, 53-31 with a victory over Duke. What did we make of this matchup, and how does he just keep intensifying the conversation of what he deserves at the end of this season, more than likely?
Yeah, you're probably talking about the Heisman Trophy or hinting at the Heisman Trophy. Couldn't agree more. I think we have today, and it's November 2nd. This is going to change dramatically as we go through November. November is when the Heisman Trophy and any individual award is won. This is when voters are paying the most attention. And Cam Ward just continues to be spectacular. He's getting it done in terms of numbers. He's the leader of one of the remaining, and there are very few undefeated teams left in the country. It's not a great Miami team. I don't think it's a national championship caliber team. Those close calls to me are red flags. They're concerns. But the fact that Cam Ward can always pull this team out of the fire, they're the cardiac canes because of Cam Ward. And you're spot on, Kasey. I mean, when he needed to turn it up in the second half, that's exactly what he did. Those 5 touchdown passes, 4 were from midway through in the third quarter till the end of that game. So, Miami's defense led up a lot of big plays to Malik Murphy and Duke. Surprisingly so. Defense was kind of soft, but when they needed the offense, Cam Ward was there. His top target, Xavier Restrepo, was there. So Miami continues to win, and it creates an interesting race in the ACC because it looked like there were 4 contenders. Clemson was one. They've lost, still in the mix, but they have a loss. Pitt had no ACC losses. They're going down hard tonight to SMU, 41-11 at this point. So right now the favorites are Miami and SMU, which is very strange. I mean, that's not what we expected in terms of the ACC, but Miami has been nothing if not exciting this season.
Absolutely. The stars were not aligning for what we're seeing now, but that's what makes college football so exciting, especially in November when we continue to see who's going to progress and how things are going to shake out for some other teams that are obviously going to fall behind, because you can only have so many teams in the spotlight when it comes to bowl season and the national championship conversation. Just circling back to keep everybody up to date on the scores, South Carolina was able to convert. Now their pointage is at 44-20 over Texas A&M. We thought this was going to be a bigger defensive battle and low scoring, hence where the total started originally, but 2-minute warning is what I'm seeing in this matchup as Texas A&M just tries to add some points to their tally, but I don't think they can catch up to 44 with 2 minutes left in the fourth. Then as for the Clemson-Louisville game, still sitting at 33-21, Louisville with the ball, 4th and 13 at Clemson's 45. 46 seconds left in this one, so as Rich mentioned, looking like the loss for Clemson coming in here. Kentucky trying to grab some points, 3:51 left in the fourth quarter, 28-18 is where they're trailing versus Tennessee, and then the score remains stagnant for Pittsburgh versus SMU, 47-11, as Pittsburgh just tries to get out of this one alive. Now, I will say, you also mentioned the fact that Miami's defense just kind of needing to help out a lot more there, but still giving up too many progressive plays to Murphy and company. Murphy sitting with 325 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 3 turnovers. If not for the 3 turnovers, we could have been talking about different results, but it's not about looking back. It's about turning the page and looking forward. So we'll see what adjustments Miami can make to help them kind of steer away from some of these mistakes, because as the competition increases, that's not going to pan out too well. We do have under 2 minutes here, but we'll kind of continue to move forward on some of the top games that we saw today, Rich. Now, we talked about Ohio State versus Penn State, Duke versus Miami, but let's just talk a little bit about Ole Miss and the steamroll versus Arkansas, 63-31. Typically, we've seen a little bit of a stronger defensive effort out of Arkansas, or were the Rebels just too much to handle?
Yeah, this one surprised me as well, Kasey. It's funny. I've been hammering Lane Kiffin all week in any possible venue that I can, because his offense has been terrible ever since SEC play began about a month ago. He fattened up against non-conference opponents, weaker teams, but in SEC games, they're prior to today averaging just 24 points a game. But Jackson Dart just went ballistic, 6 touchdowns. 5 touchdown passes to one player, Jordan Watkins. This is exactly what Ole Miss needed. Ole Miss looked like, after those 2 losses, Kentucky and LSU, it looked like they were fading in terms of the playoff picture. Today really just invigorates their candidacy. I think Ole Miss now, huge game next weekend against Georgia. If they could beat the Bulldogs at home, Ole Miss, I think you could put them in the playoffs at that point.
Absolutely. And they have a couple scripts to pull through and see how to bring the best compete possible versus Georgia next weekend. And I think that's going to be an extremely exciting game, because Carson Beck just continues to turn over the ball. So how will the Rebels capitalize? We'll find out. We'll continue to unpack this conversation on the other side of this break. Stay with us here at College Football Today, the post-game show on SportsGrid.
He will be 2-7 against top 5 opponents in his 6 full seasons with the Buckeyes.
Now you're going to take on the road, one of the best rush defenses in the country in Penn State. You're already having trouble rushing the ball. So what does that mean, Ben? That means Ohio State is going to have to rely on Will Howard to throw the ball on the road.
The early line, only on SportsGrid.
Anyone that's been to a sporting event, the atmosphere before a game, I think Game Time Decisions has that same exact atmosphere. This is our arena. This is what we do. There is going to be an energy to Game Time Decisions that you will feel night in and night out. The excitement you get when you lock your bets in, when you're figuring out what you want to do, we can zone in on the biggest games each night. I want this to be the place that people come to before the games start, so they feel as ready as possible to lock in their cards. We are going to hit every single one of those markets that you need to know about. We're going to go through every single thing, and I've got a great team behind me that's going to help me get the job done. There is not going to be a better place, I promise you, than Game Time Decisions to get that new information, react to it, and be able to then bet accordingly. We will have everything at our disposal, and we will use that to our advantage. I'm Kevin Walsh. Tune into Game Time Decisions from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern on SportsGrid.
Back at it with college football today here on SportsGrid TV. Running through the Saturday slate with Kasey Hudson and Rich Cirminello. We were just discussing basically what to expect maybe next week out of the Ole Miss Rebels and how they can compete with Georgia, but more importantly, what this 63-31 performance actually meant today. Rich, you ran through some of the statistics of Jackson Dart. He's been one of my favorite guys to keep an eye on when it comes to the Heisman conversation. sitting closer to the top, within top 5 or actually top 6 the last I saw there, but we're going to know that those are going to keep moving around a little bit until the conversation comes to a close. What did this win over Arkansas mean for this organization heading into the matchup versus Georgia? You were touching on that before we went to the break.
Yeah, I think it was huge beyond just the statistics. 63-31, pretty good Arkansas team, by the way. This was not Mississippi State. This was not Vandy from 4 years ago. This was an Arkansas team that's above 500, has competed very well in the SEC this year. I thought this might have been a more competitive game. And again, just to go back to the last segment, Ole Miss has been sputtering offensively. Defense has been great prior to today. Giving up just 11 points a game. They have some all-stars on there like Chris Paul, Walter Nolan, TJ Daugherty, playing very well defensively, but the offense was in quicksand until today. This was the perfect timing to unlock Jackson Dart. We know how much talent he has. We know that he has dual threat potential, but you had to see it. They had to build some confidence against Arkansas. It's exactly what they did. So they have momentum going into Georgia next week. And Georgia continues, Texas game aside, let's put that one aside. We know what their potential is and what they could do in Austin. But other than that, they have been so awkward and so average. Florida, you mentioned it. DJ Lagway, done for the game. I really hope he's not done for the season. He was carted off. I wanted to see the development of this kid in November. Just enormous potential, enormous, just a true freshman quarterback. He was in because Graham Mertz is done for the year, the former Wisconsin quarterback. Florida was 2020 late in the fourth quarter. They were using a freshman quarterback who had no experience and really no business being out there, and they were hanging with Georgia for almost all 60 minutes. So Georgia's vulnerable. That game is at Ole Miss. Lane Kiffin needs this one badly, and it's early in the week. I need a little more time to evaluate. But off the cuff, I think Ole Miss is going to be very, very dangerous against Georgia in this game.
Yeah, I could potentially see them overwhelming Georgia because it's just not a great sign that you struggle against a Florida team that took a minute to find their own identity so far this season, and you don't find success until they have a number of players go down to injury, one of those key players being their playmaker. So I think that speaks volumes. We saw some shakiness out of Georgia over the last couple of weeks, not to speak ill versus Georgia. Still a very talented roster there, but a number of mistakes that other teams can capitalize on depending on their health and consistency. Kind of sticking with the SEC here, going from Ole Miss, sitting not too far down, middle of the pack in the SEC, but Texas A&M kind of sitting at the top there. Conference-wise, 5-0. Well, Texas A&M falls short to South Carolina. 44-20 is now the final in the book. So, Rich, what did we make of this game? Because for starters, Sellers was all over the place. Magnificent performance, 244 through the air, 2 touchdowns, but then he was leading the rush for his team up until that fourth quarter. There were 106 rushing yards through 15 carries and 1 rushing touchdown for South Carolina's quarterback. What does this win mean for South Carolina, who has just been knocking on the door of every top team in the nation that they've competed against this season?
Yeah, so true. I mean, this was reeking of a trap game for Texas A&M. Just last week, emotional win. Marcel Reed miraculously comes off the bench, leads the Aggies to a comeback victory over LSU. Everyone this week, myself included, talking about A&M, Mike Elko, the job that they're doing, the fact, as you said, only SEC team going into Week 10 without a conference loss. Going to South Carolina, Williams-Brice Stadium, Columbia always rocks. And Shane Beamer has been a giant killer from the moment he took that job. You bring up a really good point, Kasey. They've been knocking on the door. 2-point loss to LSU, 3-point loss to Alabama. This looked like A&M was vulnerable, and boy, were they ever. And the storyline for me going into Sunday morning is 5 teams now with 1 loss in conference play. This is going to be a wild race to Atlanta and the SEC title game.
And I'm so glad you set it up that way, because that's exactly where we're going to pick up after the break, because we got a Penn State fan in the building here at SportsGrid TV, but it may have shaken up some things in the SEC that we got to continue to break down and how this can mess with the race to the finish line. So don't go anywhere. Stay with us here on SportsGrid TV watching college football today.
He will be 2-7 against top 5 opponents in his 6 full seasons with the Buckeyes.
Now you're going to take on the road, one of the best rush defenses in the country in Penn State. You're already having trouble rushing the ball. So what does that mean, Ben? That means Ohio State is going to have to rely on Will Howard to throw the ball on the road.
The Early Line, only on SportsGrid.
Anyone that's been to a sporting event, the atmosphere before a game, I think Game Time Decisions has that same exact atmosphere. This is our arena. This is what we do. There is going to be an energy to Game Time Decisions that you will feel night in and night out. The excitement you get when you lock your bets in, when you're figuring out what you want to do, we can zone in on the biggest games each night. I want this to be the place that people come to before the games start so they feel as ready as possible to lock in their cards. We are going to hit every single one of those markets that you need to know about. We're going to go through every single thing, and I've got a great team behind me that's going to help me get the job done. There is not going to be a better place, I promise you, than Game Time Decisions to get that new information, react to it, and be able to then bet accordingly. We will have everything at our disposal, and we will use that to our advantage. I'm Kevin Walsh. Tune into Game Time Decisions from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern on SportsGrid.
Welcome back into college football today, the post-game show with Kasey Hudson and Rich Cirminello running through the Saturday slate of this college football day. Look, we got a number of games that we started to get into and some more things to unpack, but before we went to that break, we were talking about Texas A&M falling short to South Carolina. I love how you put that. It was a trap, but yes, it was the Aggies' trap to fall into and fall through, if you will. And Dubs wouldn't be too happy if he was with us tonight because he is an Aggies fan, but 44-20 being the final in the books for Carolina to pull off the victory over the Aggies. Now, a number of things to put into perspective with some of the teams that lost today. Significantly, Penn State losing, Texas A&M losing. How is the race kind of shifting because of some of these losses that were delivered today?
Yeah, you're seeing a tightening, especially in the SEC. I mentioned before the break, you've got 5 teams now with 1 conference loss, 2 massive games in the league next weekend. I already touched on Ole Miss against Georgia, but LSU and Alabama off today. They face off. Great rivalry, always a lot of talent, a lot of intensity for that game. That'll have a big impact. Alabama's got 2 conference losses. LSU has just 1. So there'll be plenty of shaking out as we go through the month of November. Towards the end of the month, Texas versus Texas A&M. One of the sport's great rivalries. Haven't seen that one in a long time since A&M went to the SEC. Texas had stayed in the Big 12 at that time. But across the country, you're seeing races start to tighten, shake up. You're seeing teams fall off. Big 12, I think, is going to be fascinating once we get a chance to sift through the damage of Kansas State and Iowa State losing. BYU off this weekend. They're the big winner in the Big 12. So it's going to be a fascinating race in all of the conferences. And oh, by the way, we didn't even talk about Oregon today. It really speaks to how far Michigan has fallen. You would think that top-ranked Oregon going into the Big House would be a big deal. But Michigan is so mediocre this year. I think we knew what was coming. No Will Johnson, their elite cornerback for Michigan against Dylan Gabriel in that passing attack. So Oregon just continues to roll. Looks like Oregon, Ohio State, but you never know at this point.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that
I'm forgetting about Indiana, by the way, which is really disrespectful. That speaks volumes that I didn't mention Indiana now, doesn't it?
No, but you're safe. You're safe because, as I mentioned, I feel like so much happened today. Your head is on a swivel, and it's like, oh, Oregon had another good performance. Oh my gosh, Michigan put Warren back in. He started last week, but what's the identity of this team? And then it was like, oh, Minnesota tops Illinois. Illinois has been on an upset alert in a number of matchups. It's just like it was the perfect day to just be like, hey, your focus is not going to lock in on anything, but the excitement is going to be there wherever wherever your head tends to swivel. So kind of sticking with Oregon versus Michigan for just a second here, because I got to ask this question. Oregon gets a tap on the shoulder to come back in and run this offense for Michigan last week. But more importantly, he lost the starting position not that far into the season to begin with. 165 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. Not a horrible performance from what we've seen in comparison to him do, but is Michigan's, I don't want to say shortcomings to be so dramatic, but is Michigan's shortcomings just kind of a lack of emphasis in the offseason, not managing the reality of the pieces they no longer had and how they needed this offense to run in order to compete?
Yeah, I think I'm guilty of beating this drum a little too much over the past couple of weeks, but I do think it bears repeating. Michigan had every opportunity in the offseason to address their quarterback issue. They knew what they had on the roster. Jack Tuttle's a seventh-year quarterback. He has since retired. Davis Warren, former walk-on. Alex Orji, a very gifted athlete, but they knew that this kid was not ready to compete as a true quarterback in the Big Ten. They knew they had shortcomings behind center and didn't address that. That I can guarantee you will change this next offseason. You can go into the portal, look at all of the teams that are having success this year, Case. We talked about Indiana. Curtis Rourke came from Ohio and the MAC. We've talked about Vanderbilt. Diego Pavia came from New Mexico State. So many of these schools that are having success. Pitt prior to tonight, Eli Holstein began at Alabama. There's no reason why Michigan should not have gotten a veteran quarterback in the portal. They would have been in better shape. The defense is championship caliber. This is a top-notch defense. They have no passing game this year. So that was negligence during the offseason. But again, that won't happen a second time. I can assure you that they're going to get one, possibly 2 quarterbacks out of the portal that have proven themselves up to this point.
Yeah, and it is worth repeating because I'm sure for Michigan fans, their heads are swirling like, how did we get here? But I always kind of look at it as there's no synergy, there's no pattern to the quarterbacks they keep trying to have a plug-and-play offense with. And at that, it just gets a little careless in my personal opinion. But you don't want to disrupt the development of potential quarterbacks to run that offense. So a lot for Michigan to digest there as they move through this season. We won't leave out Indiana. They deserve their flowers as they continue to spear perfection. They come out on top 47-10, but let's just say Michigan State made it very interesting in that first quarter. They had 10 points holding off Indiana from any success in the first quarter. Then second quarter comes through and it's all Indiana from the second through the fourth. So what did we make of the continued successful performances for Indiana?
2 takeaways for me. Never easy winning road conference games, by the way. Jonathan Smith has gradually been turning around Michigan State, so this was not going to be a cakewalk. My 2 takeaways are this. Number one, I wanted to first see Curtis Rourke. He missed last week's game, had thumb surgery a couple of weeks ago, came back extremely quickly from a surgery on his throwing hand. Wanted to see if there was any rust. There wasn't. 4 touchdown passes, no turnovers today. The biggest storyline for me as we move through November and probably the playoffs, which is insane to say for Indiana, their defense, despite the fact that you're not going to see any All-Americans on that side of the ball, defense keeps playing better and better and better. This is more than just an offensive team. They're averaging more than 40 points a game, but they're starting to balance it with defense. So again, shame on me. I'm part of the media that tends to just dismiss a team like Indiana. 9-0, Kurt Cignetti's doing a great job. And you've got 3 power players right now in the conference. Oregon on top, Ohio State number 2, 1-point loss to Oregon, and Indiana sitting there at 9-0. I think it's Michigan this week. This team at worst should be 11-1, which will be good enough for a playoff spot.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned how the defense is just continuing to elevate, kind of match the pace that the offense is putting up there for them, because just to illuminate it a little further, they held Michigan State to 10 points. Previously, Washington to 7 points. We know what Washington can do and deliver offensively, so that's still pretty great. Then before that, Nebraska to just a touchdown, Northwestern 24 points, and then Maryland. So ever since Northwestern, there's just been a massive turnaround to Indiana's defensive performances, which is going to put them in a pretty brave spot. That's probably a good place to pivot before we go to this next break, because we do have to talk about Houston and their defensive abilities and how exactly they were able to overcome Kansas State 24-19 today. I talked about the few teams that they faced earlier in the season where they put up a strong defensive performance. I wasn't sure if that was going to be enough. I wasn't sure if they were going to be able to deliver offensively to go toe-to-toe with Kansas State. So 1 minute, but would you say that was probably the biggest surprise between Kansas State and Houston, the fact that Houston was able to develop offensively to secure a win?
Yeah, and they were using a backup quarterback in Zayon Chris, tremendous athlete, still developing as an all-around quarterback. Thought he had some great runs in that game. He's a Louisiana Lafayette transfer. But this has always been my mantra about college football, college sports in general. It's all about coaching. If you have the right coaching, eventually the wins will come. I think that's the case with Willie Fritz in Houston. Big fan of the way he builds programs.
Absolutely. Well, when we come back, we'll break down the 24-19 victory for the Houston Cougars and see what to expect from Kansas State moving forward, and then a couple other games in the books here before we close out on college football today. Don't go anywhere. Stay with us here on SportsGrid.
He will be 2-7 against top 5 opponents in his 6 full seasons with the Buckeyes.
Now you're going to take on the road, one of the best rush defenses in the country in Penn State. You're already having trouble rushing the ball. So what does that mean, Ben? That means Ohio State is going to have to rely on Will Howard to throw the ball on the road.
The early line, only on SportsGrid.
Anyone that's been to a sporting event, the atmosphere before a game, I think Game Time Decisions has that same exact atmosphere. This is our arena. This is what we do. There is going to be an energy to Game Time Decisions that you will feel night in and night out. The excitement you get when you lock your bets in, when you're figuring out what you want to do, we can zone in on the biggest games each night. I want this to be the place that people come to before the games start so they feel as ready as possible to lock in their cards. We are going to hit every single one of those markets that you need to know about. We're going to go through every single thing, and I've got a great team behind me that's going to help me get the job done. There is not going to be a better place, I promise you, than Game Time Decisions to get that new information, react to it, and be able to then bet accordingly. We will have everything at our disposal, and we will use that to our advantage. I'm Kevin Walsh. Tune into Game Time Decisions from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern on SportsGrid.
Back at it with college football today, running through the Saturday slate. Where we left off before the break, talking about Houston versus Kansas State. Houston coming out with the win 24-19. And what I really want to ask you about this matchup, Rich, is the fact that we've seen a number of games where Kansas State has had a slower start, especially in the first quarter. When they can't get their run game going, it seems like the other team has kind of solved them a little bit. They always look to Avery Johnson to be that dual threat quarterback. 238 passing yards, 1 touchdown, but 2 costly interceptions. It was Gideon's on the ground. They still couldn't get much going there. 50 rushing yards through 17 carries. Avery Johnson only sitting at 18 rushing yards. So typically what we see here is the panic button goes off, and then all of a sudden Avery Johnson is just running for his life. But in what ways did Houston kind of solve that versus Kansas State today?
Yeah, I think the defensive scheme today for Houston was, to your point, which was spot on. stop the running game. That is where Kansas State is at their best. And I think we're going to see a time, Avery Johnson's just in his second season. I think we're going to see a time where he is a true complete quarterback. I just don't think he's there right now. We talked about Nico Iamaleava, same class, both from the class of 2023. Both terrific athletes, but still developing as true passing quarterbacks. So Houston, which has great athletes on the edge, not so much at the line of scrimmage, but their safeties and linebackers very quick, sideline to sideline. The commitment was we are not going to let DJ Giddens or Avery Johnson beat us on the ground. We're going to force Johnson to make plays through the air. He was okay, but he was not prolific, had those turnovers. And again, I can't stress this enough. November means a lot of things for a lot of different teams. You have big programs that are going for titles and college football playoff berths. But there are a lot of schools out there like Houston, like Baylor, which just beat TCU. Baylor, third straight victory. They're starting to trend north, now over 500 for Dave Aranda. So a lot of teams now are starting to build for possible games in December and then a bridge to 2025, because the coaching carousel is going to start spinning before you know it. And guys like Dave Aranda, they are coaching for their futures right now.
And before we tap further into that, more so start talking about what the potential national championship picture could look like. Some odds have changed, obviously, over the last couple of weeks. Let's touch on another game here quickly. We've got Iowa State ranked 11, falling short to Texas Tech. 23-22 was the narrow escape for Texas Tech. Now, we did see Texas Tech in control in that first quarter, grabbing 10 points, holding Iowa State to just a field goal, but then Iowa State made some course corrections there, had a much stronger second quarter carrying through, but this game went neck and neck all the way till the end, obviously, with this 23-22 score indication. So what did we pull away from this one?
A big head scratcher for me. I admit I did not see this one coming. Texas Tech has not been playing well. Baron Morton, their quarterback, played today but was not at 100%. The defense was horrible in the month of October. I thought Iowa State, with their depth in the backfield, their depth at wide receiver, their defense in general, Kasey, that's secondary, which a lot of folks don't know. Number one in the country heading into this weekend in pass efficiency defense. They've always done a good job of developing defensive backs. This year, no different. They're very good in underclassmen. They have a ton of veterans as well. They just could not put it together. There were a few drives late in which I think the weather got in the way for Rocco Becht. Heavy rain, actually heavy rain throughout the plains. We had a lot of delays in the state of Texas in games. But Iowa State was very wet. It was very slick. It was slick for both teams, obviously. But they could not make stops at the end. The MVP for me, Texas Tech running back Taj Brooks. He is often the MVP for that team. But considering where these teams were heading into today, this game was in Ames, Iowa. Did not see Texas Tech pulling the upset. So Iowa State now with their first loss. But not everything is lost, because they're still very much in the Big 12 race. And if you win your conference now in the age of a 12-team playoff, you're going to get one of those automatic bowl bids, and not just get a bid, but you're going to get a bye in the first round as well.
Yeah, definitely. Another game in the books here. Tennessee pulling off the victory 28-18 over Kentucky. And then Pittsburgh and SMU still trailing along, 1:33 left in the fourth from what I'm seeing. But now kind of pivoting over to the national championship odds and how this picture may mold. The top three teams in the odds right now pulled off a victory today. Ohio State, Georgia, and Oregon. Ohio State's still sitting at the top of the charts at plus 350. Georgia shortly behind them at plus 400, and Oregon sitting at plus 450. What do you initially make of this, considering where these teams lie today and the victories they also pulled off today?
The steadiest team that I've seen so far this season is Oregon. So I think the fact that they're on top makes a lot of sense to me. The defense continues to get better. I love the veteran leadership of Dylan Gabriel. They have plenty of weapons. Jordan James in the backfield, Evan Storton, Tez Johnson at wide receiver, a great coach in Dan Lanning. So they're where they need to be. The one that I'm curious about and continue to be is Georgia. I know the talent is there. Kirby Smart has won back-to-back national championships. They have an elite coaching staff. They have the pedigree. They have the muscle memory to win championships, but having a hard time figuring out what's going on with Carson Beck. You touched on it earlier. 3 interceptions today, far more interceptions this season than he had all of last year. Maybe Georgia, when they need to, can put their foot on the gas, but I think that's going to catch up to them at some point. Watch out for Texas. Texas with a bye week this week. I think once Quinn Ewers shakes off all of the rust and he kind of gets more comfortable in the saddle, I think Texas has a chance to make a long run, maybe win the ACC, but really have a long run as far as the playoffs go.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. We started to see him get back into that quality form versus Vanderbilt the other weekend. While that was a neck-and-neck game, them coming through only 27-24, we started to see a little bit more of that comfort and confidence come into play. Coming down the stretch for Texas, they go up against Florida, Arkansas, Kentucky, and then close out the season versus Texas A&M, as you mentioned earlier. So I like where their odds sit. They're sitting at plus 550 when it comes to the national championship conversation. We'll talk about some dark horses, touch on the Heisman conversation before we close out here on College Football Today, the post-game show with Kasey Hudson and Rich Cirminello. Make sure you're following SportsGrid over at SportsGrid, but more importantly, stick with us on the other side of this final quick break.
He will be 2-7 against top 5 opponents in his 6 full seasons with the Buckeyes.
Now you're going to take on the road, one of the best rush defenses in the country in Penn State. You're already having trouble rushing the ball. So what does that mean, Ben? That means Ohio State is going to have to rely on Will Howard to throw the ball on the road.
The Early Line, only on SportsGrid.
Anyone that's been to a sporting event, the atmosphere before a game, I think Game Time Decisions has that same exact atmosphere. This is our arena. This is what we do. There is going to be an energy to Game Time Decisions that you will feel night in and night out. The excitement you get when you lock your bets in, when you're figuring out what you want to do, we can zone in on the biggest games each night. I want this to be the place that people come to before the games start so they feel as ready as possible to lock in their cards. We are going to hit every single one of those markets that you need to know about. We're going to go through every single thing, and I've got a great team behind me that's going to help me get the job done. There is not going to be a better place, I promise you, than Game Time Decisions to get that new information, react to it, and be able to then bet accordingly. We will have everything at our disposal, and we will use that to our advantage. I'm Kevin Walsh. Tune into Game Time Decisions from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern on SportsGrid.
One more rally with college football today, the postgame show with Kasey Hudson and Rich Cirminello. We were going through the playoff, well, I don't want to say playoff picture, but the potential national championship picture. We're talking about the top 3 teams, also keeping a close eye on Texas, sitting at plus 550 odds right now in the running. Now, I just want to get your opinion on something else here, Rich, before we close out the national championship talk. What's a dark horse team or a team that everybody should be keeping their eye on, maybe outside of Texas or any of the top 5 contenders between Ohio State, Georgia, Oregon, Texas, and Miami?
That's a tough question. It's tough to find anybody outside of the chalk right now. I probably would look toward the SEC outside of Georgia and Texas. We talked about Ole Miss. Very impressed by the way they played against Arkansas. Rebels could be a possibility. I would also look at Tennessee as a possible dark horse in terms of the national championship. Struggling, though, to find teams out of the ACC outside of Miami. I don't see it. Big 12 is fun, but Big 12 is not going to produce a national champion, in my opinion. Love what BYU is doing. I don't think they have the talent to make a deep run in the playoffs. Big 10, we mentioned the three teams who are most in the mix, Indiana, Oregon, and Ohio State. I would have to say SEC right now, outside of the Big Two, give me Ole Miss or Tennessee.
All right, I like that. Ole Miss is tied with Notre Dame at plus 3,000 odds here, and then Indiana sitting at 35-1 odds as well. So key month in college football as we see what shakes out. Now kind of pivoting over to the Heisman conversation, because some of these performances will impact certain guys more than others. Cameron Ward remaining at the top of the Heisman odds. Plus 185 is what I'm seeing at FanDuel right now. Travis Hunter right behind him at plus 230. Dylan Gabriel at plus 280. But if we move down the board a little bit, Jackson Dart, 17-1 odds. Curtis Rourke at 22-1 odds. So what do you make of these top 7 or 8 guys so far?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. First off, I forgive me if I said this last week, but I think at least at this stage we're overthinking who the leader should be. I don't think there's a better college football player than Travis Hunter. I think we have normalized the fact that this kid is great at two distinctly different positions. We've never seen this. What he is doing as a wide receiver, one of the 5 best wide receivers in the entire country. He's also one of the 5 best cornerbacks in the entire country. We've never seen that before. This isn't Charles Woodson. This is far more than anything Charles Woodson did about a quarter of a century ago. So Travis Hunter, that's my first thought in terms of the Heisman. Love Ashton Genty. I love what he's been doing. He's going to put up 2,000 yards. Dylan Gabriel makes a lot of sense. He's a very safe pick right now. Cam Ward would be my number 2. But Travis Hunter deserves to be the favorite. Let's see what happens over the final 4 games. But he's also one of the 2 pivotal players on a 6-2 Colorado team that hasn't bowled in a number of years. So Travis Hunter's number 1. In terms of a dark horse, you and I talked a little bit about it during the break. 22-1 for Curtis Rourke. I think there's a ton of value there. He's the quarterback. He is the linchpin in a 9-0 football team that people thought would finish in 12th, 13th in the Big Ten this year. Now they'll have a shot to win the league. Michigan this week, high-profile game, should win that one in Bloomington. November 23rd, coming off a bye week, Kasey, at the Horseshoe, Columbus, facing Ohio State. If Indiana upsets Ohio State and Curtis Rourke has some impact in that, I think he could vault into being the Heisman frontrunner with a week or 2 left in the season. So at 22-1, I think there's a lot of value.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of a dark horse conversation, but more importantly, an underdog. And to come back from injury, as you were talking about, and to not have a waiver in his performance and help his team pull off a win today, I think sparks a good fire there. We talked about it a couple weeks ago, but I'm going to put you back in the hot seat before we close out here on college football today. Well, who do you see in the national championship? Who do you want to see in the national championship? Has anything changed in the last few weeks for you?
Not particularly. I'd like to see the 2 best teams. I want to see the Blue Bloods. I mean, it's always nice to see a Cinderella, but give me some combination of Oregon, Georgia. I mentioned that, I think, when we had this conversation. Oregon, Texas, some kind of matchup like that would be outstanding. Biggest takeaway for the playoffs, though, Kasey, is I think it's great for college football. We're going to have a fantastic December and January heading into the national championship game on the 20th.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you for making this enjoyable, just as enjoyable all the football was today. Make sure you're following SportsGrid over at SportsGrid, as well as Rich Cirminello. We're closing out college football, but we'll catch you back next week.